My colleague Heather McDonald has an incredible essay in the latest City Journal titled The Great Feminization of the American University. And she looks at the statistics, she looks at the demographic detail, and then she draws some startling conclusions about what this demographic change has caused culturally in American universities. And right off the top, she gives you a sense of this change statistically. She points out that 75% of Ivy League presidents are now female, 66% of college administrators are now female, and 58% of all undergraduates, measured as the students completing a BA degree in recent years, are also female. So you have somewhere along the lines of a ratio of 2-to-1 or higher on average, female to male. And of course, this will have cultural consequences. And Heather's conclusion is that, quote, female students and administrators often exist in a codependent relationship, united by the concepts of victim identity and of trauma. For university females, there is not apparently strength in numbers. The more females' ranks increase, the more we hear about a mass nervous breakdown on campus. Heather is a great rhetorical mind. She's a great statistical mind. She's a great legal mind. And she never minces her words. This is her conclusion, that what she calls the great feminization of the American university is leading us to a mass nervous breakdown on campus. In this video, I'd like to go over what this means, provide a little further analysis and commentary, and see if we can't untangle this change and really try to explore it in a deeper way. Right off the bat, a concept that I think you should have handy comes from a research psychologist at the University of Toronto and a friend of mine named J.D. Haltigan. He's been writing on the conflict or the imbalance between trait systemization and trait empathization. These are psychological concepts that represent a cluster of attitudes and attributes and qualities that can be loosely and archetypally defined as representing the masculine and the feminine. In this dichotomy, in this categorization system, trait systemization represents rationalism, order, kind of masculine virtues, while trait empathization represents compassion and empathy and feminine virtues. This is not to say that one is good or one is bad. I think what psychologists have told us, and really dating back to kind of biblical references we've known for forever throughout human history, is that mankind must have both sets of virtues. Mankind must have them in some kind of balance. And when they get out of balance, you start to see social and interpersonal and individual problems. So there are cultures and institutions that have an imbalance toward trait systemization. They are too masculine, too punitive, too restrictive, too authoritarian. And then you have, in other institutions, an imbalance toward trait empathization. They are too permissive, they are too coddling, they are too compassionate in a way that then becomes pathological. And Haltigan, and Heather McDonald as well, are making the argument that our institutions, in this case the university system, has become too overloaded toward trait empathization. And that when you have the virtue of compassion, which is of course good in and of itself, it can actually become pathological and actually have unintended negative consequences if it's not balanced with a sense of the systemization or a sense of order and hierarchy and competition and more masculine virtues. And look, I've been observing this both in my own experience, in my recent reporting on DEI in public universities, and then in my role as a trustee of New College of Florida. And I've noticed that what we have, in a sense, is a university as a therapeutic institution. The culture is not oriented towards the production of knowledge, towards merit, which is competitive and hierarchical, but now towards a system based on personal identity and based on a model of therapeutic. So the university as a place for personal exploration, as a place to heal from trauma and dysregulation, as a place that provides a therapeutic environment rather than a competitive and knowledge-seeking environment. And I'd like to go over some of these terms and attributes that I've noticed over time to flesh out exactly what this might mean. The modern university, I think, first can be characterized as having adopted left-wing victim narratives, not on the axis of economics or race, although certainly those are there, but on the axis of the therapeutic and the psychological. And so traditionally, left-wing thought, you have this split between oppressor and oppressed. Under kind of orthodox Marxism, that was an economic axis between the capitalist and the proletariat. Under something like critical race theory, it becomes a racial axis. For example, the white oppressor and the black or non-white oppressed. But in the modern kind of feminized university, you see something different altogether. You see it on the axis of psychology. And so you have the traumatizer and the traumatized is the fundamental dynamic. It's really the playground of left-wing victim narratives in this therapeutic university that is overloaded on trait empathization. And so what does this mean? This means that, of course, taking for granted that there is an economic component, there is a racial component, but if you look at the psychological component, it is really something that shifts into an interior set of values, an interior set of virtues. Subjective experience is prioritized over objective reality, and the hierarchies are based on these invisible traumatic experiences or categorizations. And so what does this mean? The second attribute that I've noticed is that individual pathology is valorized as a form of marginalized identity. And so when you have this victim narrative along a psychological line, all of a sudden, individual psychopathologies, individual traumas, individual problems, individual personality disorders, something even like obesity, a kind of physical disorder or dysregulation, is elevated into the marginalized identity that provides the moral center of these victim narratives. And so this opens the pathways quite significantly. It opens participation in this great narrative. As McDonald explains, and as I think we've seen over and over and over, you give people more entry points. You don't have to be poor. You don't have to be a kind of non-white racial minority. You can actually have a kind of marginalized sexual identity, for example, based on queer theory. You can have a marginalized physical identity, whether it's through a kind of traditional physical disability or something like an obesity that's valorized through fat studies and other disciplines. And then you can actually just have a mental illness, or you can claim to have a mental illness. And these personality disorders become not a problem of interior dysregulation, but they're projected onto society as evidence of a kind of victimized or traumatized identity. You see this everywhere in university campuses. The third point that I think is important is when you take the victim narrative based on psychology, you elevate individual pathology into a form of marginalized identity, you create a social system that incentivizes certain kinds of behaviors. I think actually, in some ways, if you look at the DSM-5 criteria for borderline personality disorder, and you take them as a metaphor for a social process, you're actually incentivizing many of those traits. You're incentivizing emotional lability or kind of emotional displays. You're incentivizing, in some ways, a kind of paranoid relationship between individual and society. You're incentivizing the kind of flaunting of trauma or traumatic experiences, and you're creating a set of social games that are not designed really for bringing that individual to health, but designed for creating a narrative between self and society that ultimately is a condemnation of society, whether or not that actually results in an internal regulation or an internal process of coming to health. Fourth, how does this express itself in an institutional setting? Well, it expresses itself through bureaucracy. In my reporting recently on public universities in the state of Florida, I've been really flabbergasted. You know the story about the increase in administration, the increase in bureaucracy as a statistical matter. You have, I think, somewhere almost now more than 1 million college administrators in the United States. It's a huge number of people. But if you actually break it down into its component parts, you see something very interesting. You see massive counseling centers that are based on left-wing therapeutic ideologies. You have these cultural centers that are divvied up by race, but have absorbed victim narratives on a psychological axis. You have, so-called queer spaces, and then you have massive DEI departments that are both standalone academic or standalone administrative departments and also embedded units or task forces or committees within all of the academic departments. And when you read their statements, it's very clear. This isn't revolutionary Marxist-Leninist rhetoric like you would see from the Black Panther Party from the 1960s. This is therapeutic rhetoric that is more feminine in its characteristics and its tone. It's appealing to people through more manipulative strategies rather than directly aggressive strategies. And so if you take those four categories, those four attributes, what does that do to this new leadership, these new DEI apparatchiks? What role do they play? Well, you can see it very clearly as you look at the rhetoric, as you look at their statements, as you look at their programming. The left-wing diversity bureaucrat, again, almost predominantly female, is the rescuer of the traumatized. And so in this victim narrative, it's something of a twist. Previously, they would say the proletarian rises up and overthrows the capitalist. It was violent, it was aggressive, it was about flipping existing hierarchies. In this new model of the therapeutic institution, the left-wing diversity bureaucrat rescues the traumatized and turns the personal trauma into a moral and socially significant phenomenon. It is an internal twist on this narrative, and this gives meaning to the diversity bureaucrat as a rescuer, as someone that is involved in protecting, in a more maternal sense, the traumatized, protecting the weak. Again, this is good. You need this in a society, but it's become pathologized. Because the problem is that by elevating this narrative, by elevating personal pathology into a valorized identity, creating social incentives that actually encourage this kind of behavior and expression, you get a very pathological system that incentivizes unhealth, that incentivizes disorder, that incentivizes these emotional displays that don't actually solve the psychological problem, but use the psychological problem to push a political line. And this is, I think in most cases, unintentional. I don't ascribe malice to most of these folks. I think if you talk to them, they're genuinely committed to their political ideology. They're genuinely committed to helping people. But what they don't see is that when you overload trait empathization, compassion and altruism can become pathological, and they could actually not just extend or perpetuate damage, but create new damage for individuals and for the institution as a whole. And as Heather McDonald explains very brilliantly in her essay, these social systems can be hijacked and they turn into a codependent relationship that benefits no one, but keeps the bureaucracy growing. And so that's what you see as far as institution. What does this mean for students? I'd argue that it creates something of a culture trap. There is a bureaucracy, there is a system of incentives, there is a social narrative through which they can participate in this great conflict between the traumatizer and the traumatized. They can rebel against the existing society that they believe is, racist, capitalist, heteropatriarchal, cisnormative, whatever category that you have. As you pit the identity against the larger social structure, you're creating a conflict that can't be resolved at the individual level. And so at universities, again, that have gone very far in the direction of a more female-dominated institution, this allows particularly white women to participate in these left-wing victim narratives that they really couldn't participate in otherwise. Of course, there's a feminist narrative pitted between men and women, but in an intersectional world, where you actually have to have multiple intersecting categories of oppressed identities, that's really not the stuff anymore. It's really not sufficient to participate deeply in this narrative. And so what happens is that you have students who can create new identities through the psychological access that gives them deeper participation in politics. And so you see this everywhere. You see you can actually look at social media profiles, for example, of young people, of college students, and to see how they're constructing their identity for the world. And what you'll find is that they'll put gender pronouns in their bios. You'll see they'll have queer identities such as trans, non-binary, pansexual, etc. There is a kind of plethora of options now, hundreds of different neo-identities based on queer theory. And you'll also see physical disabilities or obesity, for example, which is no longer considered just a health condition or a limitation, but obesity is actually considered an oppressed identity. It gives you another point of participation. And then you'll see actual, kind of DSM-5 mental disorders as political identities. People will actually put whatever their diagnoses might be in their biographies, in their public social media profiles, to say they have, bipolar disorder, to say they have, borderline personality disorder, to say they have ADHD, to say that they have, trauma or depression, which again is not to denigrate those conditions. It's not to shame people. It's not to say that we should suppress all conversation of those. Quite the opposite. But what we're seeing here is not a sense of, I'm talking about this in order to resolve the problem. It's saying I'm talking about this in order to wield it as a political identity and a political weapon in distinction or in contradiction to the reigning social order, the reigning oppressive social structures. And I think that I can use New College of Florida as an example to understand this demographic shift and to understand the related cultural shift. And so the data is quite clear. The student body at New College is 66% female. In other words, it's 2-to-1 female to male amongst students. It has a high percentage of alternative sexual identities, things like trans, non-binary, pansexual. Again, political categories that have been created by queer theory and other related disciplines. According to the numbers, approximately a quarter of students in a recent school term engaged in counseling or psychotherapy through the Student Counseling and Health Center. And then 10% reported to the university they had considered suicide, along with a growing number of students who were temporarily detained under the Baker Act. So if you're a threat to yourself or others, you can go into a temporary detention. And so, again, 100% sympathy for any students or any human beings that are going through significant psychological challenges. I think that psychotherapy is an important tool in pursuing health and pursuing an integration of personality. But these numbers are meaningful. These numbers are very different than they were in the past. And this change has to be looked at, not just from the point of view of automatic affirmation, the point of view of a political narrative that this conforms to, but the point of view of an actual debate about what does this mean? How does it change the culture? And when we look at New College, I think you can also see this expressing itself through the leadership. When I first went to New College, I had an actual showdown with the provost and the president, whom we subsequently fired, about even being able to participate in a campus event. That was the first time I was going to introduce myself to the campus community, hosting an open town hall with students and then with faculty and staff. The provost, in a very kind of passive-aggressive manner, said, because we had received a death threat against my fellow trustee, Eddie Spear, that we were not allowed to proceed with the event. It was too unsafe. It was too dangerous. Even though we had a secure perimeter, we had a police presence from 3 different departments, we had a SWAT team, we had, I think, a bomb-sniffing dog from the anti-terror unit. We had all of the physical security measures that one could need to host an event. Trustee Spear and I were informed. We made a decision that the risk was worth it because we wanted to talk about the changes that were coming to campus. But the provost used all of the kind of manipulative tricks in the book, shaking her figure, appealing to safety, saying that these, ideas in essence were not welcome on campus because they were going to put people in physical danger. All a bluff. None of it was true, of course. But what it was fake empathy utilized as a left-wing power strategy. The provost in my private conversations with her was very clear. She didn't like me. She didn't like this takeover. She didn't like what DeSantis was doing. She didn't want to make any changes. She approached it with a sense of quiet indignance. She made it very clear that she was going to do anything she could, use any trick in the book to shut down reforms, to shut down conversation, to shut down what she perceived as a challenge to this therapeutic left-wing narrative on campus. You also saw student protests, again, using this language of the therapeutic as a power strategy. You've seen the kind of rhetoric of this was worth analyzing. You have really unhinged epithets. That is the basis. You are bad, you are an oppressor, you are a kind of representative of the patriarchy. All of the left-wing kind of traumatizer buzzwords all get sucked into this narrative. A really aggressive and kind of unhinged rhetoric designed to shame, designed to tag someone as an oppressor. At the same time, you have the other side of the coin, which are victim identity narratives. They're saying that these modest reforms to the campus will end up becoming make it unsafe. That they're directly targeting trans students. I mean, of course, accusations that have nothing to do with reality. There's really no logical proof that any of these things are true. They certainly don't conform with any of the stated intentions of reformers. But they're digging into and trying to create this artificial, in my view, gap between traumatizer and traumatized on both poles of that narrative. And so this results in a kind of emotional bullying using magic words. You see a lot of that in these therapeutic institutions. Words are giving magic power. You can define oppressor and oppressed. You can tap into this archetypal narrative. And then everything has to conform with this, because otherwise it's going to create danger. It's going to create trauma. It's going to create violence. It's going to create an unsafe environment, right? So that's how all of the pieces stack up together. Something that actually was the most surprising to me is that one of the most common personas at our New College of Florida board meetings, our official meetings for doing the business of the college, was not students protesting, but was actually the students' mothers protesting. You had many people that said, I'm the mother of a child at New College, and I'm here to protest these reforms. And so this is kind of bizarre. I would have been personally mortified if my mother had come to my college and protested on my behalf. There's nothing that is more infantilizing. There's nothing that is more smothering. There's nothing that's more devouring than taking your adult child and putting that adult child in the position of such kind of infantile capacity that you're going to go to their college and protest on their behalf, in lieu of them protesting for themselves. This is, of course, a great difference, again, between the 1960s protesters, which were much more aggressive. The student movement in the 1960s was actually represented by students protesting on their own behalf. Again, you would never see any parents at the protests on campus in 1968. But now what you have is a protest for students by parents in colleges, not in kindergarten, not in elementary school, not even in high school, which is kind of marginal already, but at university. And you had one woman who said that she had actually been living for 5 weeks in a hotel, 100 yards or 1,000 yards from campus. And she was kind of dedicated herself to protecting her child, to protecting the institution from this takeover. And kind of, you're sitting there listening to these folks and saying, do they not see the kind of crazy nature of this protest? You have, kind of college administrators, college students, and their mothers, all protesting these pseudo-narratives, really protesting against basic reforms, but really more deeply protesting against basic structures of reality. And in conclusion, I'd like to say also that, to be very clear, this is not a problem of women per se. Women are an essential category of being. Women are an essential part of human society. Women have essential virtues that are, in most cases, unavailable to men. This is simply to state that governance dominated by a trait empathization or governance dominated by trait systemization is simply different. This shouldn't be controversial. If you've ever spent time in a sorority house and time in a fraternity house, you can tell pretty quickly that these are very different institutions. They're governed by a different set of incentives, a different set of rules, a different method of hierarchy, and a different number of social games, right? You could see it very clearly. You show a picture of a frat house, a picture of a sorority house. Anyone could spot the difference immediately, just visually. They look very different. They sound very different. The energy inside of these institutions is very different. And so, of course, by analogy, a university that is dominated by more feminine modes of governance is going to be different. In some ways, it could be better. There's an argument. You could say, well, previous universities had been too debated by trait systemization. It squandered interpersonal. It squandered the psychological. It squandered the elevation of internal capacities or compassionate modes of relations. There's a good argument for that. That's probably been true in some cases. But by the same token, I think we can argue now that what MacDonald calls the Great Feminization of the university has maybe some benefits, but also some harms. It might have some limitations, some drawbacks. It might have its own, especially because it's new, its own set of incentives that are not in the best interest of students, not in the best interest of the public, and not in the best interest of the university as an institution designed to be in pursuit of knowledge. How does this actually play out in real life? And again, to criticize men, again, as a broad category, male leaders have abdicated in universities for 50 years. If you go back and you read the great essay by Harry Jaffa, The Reichstag is Still Burning, he documents the failure of leadership and the failure of trustee leadership at Claremont University in the 1960s. And he said, look, these folks abdicated. They were weak. They caved to the mob. They presented themselves as great stewards of the institution, but when push came to shove, they folded. They caved. They gave up. And they didn't take on the real responsibility that they had, and they didn't embody the kind of masculine virtues that they claimed to have. And what you see on campus too, again, I've seen this in my recent reporting, is that current male academic leaders, again, archetypally in general, represent the weak and absent father. There was a video that I saw from University of Central Florida. Right after the BLM kind of movement was taking off, right after the death of George Floyd, they did this webinar town hall, this kind of absurd town hall because of COVID restrictions. And the president, you look at the guy, it's just sad. You feel some pity for him because he is just kind of weakly acceding to any of the demands from not only the administration, but from students. They get on these Zoom calls and they're berating the guy. They're really just laying into him. They're humiliating him. They're attacking him. They're laying unreasonable demands. And he just says, a very meek figure, oh yeah, I'm sorry, I'll do whatever you want. Again, this leadership model for trait systemization that has been vanquished so that even men in these positions, for the most part, don't demonstrate those virtues. And then so you have this overload of trait empathization that really permeates the university culture as a whole. And the final point, what is the solution? Well, I think it is to put balance back into university life, to restore a balance between these two modes of governance, to restore a balance between empathy and hierarchy. You have to restore them in order to have a functioning university culture that isn't in an out of balance in one way or the other. And so what this is going to require is a systemization of the university. It's going to require kind of strong leadership at the top that restores ideals like merit and competition and hierarchy based on excellence, a kind of aristocratic sense that even within an egalitarian institution, you have to have an inner aristocratic pathway where students and faculty can distinguish themselves on the basis of the excellence of their work. And you also have to have a restoration of what could be termed paternal authority. Not literally in the sense that it has to be men doing so, but figuratively in the sense that you have to have a sense of order that actually says no sometimes, that tells students this is not in your best interest, that tells students there's no evidence for your assertion, that tells students you're free to protest, that's your free expression, but we're actually going to implement these reforms for these reasons, and if you want to persuade me otherwise, you have to bring a logical argument, not merely hysteria and theatrics that is, kind of squirming on the ground, appealing to left-wing victim narratives. That's not going to cut it in the new university environment. And so will we see this? I don't know. I know I'm going to be trying over the course of this year, both as a trustee at a public university, but also as a public intellectual and commenter and investigative reporter, trying to get this debate back up into our culture. And certainly in the advising that I do for legislators and governors and people in Congress, I'll be pushing this necessity And I want conservative leaders to start thinking intelligently about this. Don't get caught in the rhetorical traps. Don't get caught in the rhetorical premises, but actually fight this fight because it's the truth, because it improves the quality of institutions, and it allows people of all different backgrounds to participate in the great pursuit of knowledge, which is what our universities should be all about.